The midnight encounter. The clock struck midnight, and the soft glow of the moon spilled through the sheer curtains of Claire's apartment. She had always found solace in the quiet hours of the night, but tonight felt different, charged, electric. Claire leaned against her kitchen counter, a glass of wine in hand, her silk robe loosely tied, skimming her thighs. The day's stress was melting away, but an unfamiliar anticipation coiled low in her belly. She'd been exchanging flirty texts with her neighbor, Lucas, for weeks, each message building on the last, hinting at a meeting that neither of them could resist for much longer. A knock at the door startled her, the sound echoing in the stillness. She hesitated, her heart racing, before padding barefoot across the cool floor. Opening the door revealed Lucas, his dark, tousled hair and smoldering gaze making her pulse quicken. "I couldn't sleep," he murmured, his voice a deep rumble. Claire stepped aside, her breath hitching as he brushed past her. He smelled of cedarwood and something distinctly him. They stood in the living room, the air thick with unspoken words. He reached out, his fingers grazing her wrist, a touch so light it was almost a question. She answered with a smile, stepping closer. "I was hoping you'd come," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. His lips curled into a wicked grin as his hand slid to the small of her back, pulling her flush against him. The tension that had simmered for weeks finally broke as their mouths met in a searing kiss. Claire's fingers tangled in his hair as his hands explored the curve of her hips, the silk of her robe slipping from her shoulders. The cool air on her skin was a stark contrast to the heat between them. "I've wanted this," he said against her lips, his voice thick with desire. "You have no idea how much." "Then show me," she challenged, her eyes sparkling. Lucas needed no further encouragement. The night unfolded in a blur of heated kisses and whispered promises, their connection electric and unrelenting. Every touch, every gasp, every moment was a symphony of desire, leaving them both breathless and wanting more. As the first rays of dawn crept through the windows, Claire lay tangled with Lucas, their bodies entwined. She traced lazy circles on his chest, her heart still racing. "I think I'll be losing sleep more often," she teased. "Good," he replied, his lips brushing her temple. "I'll make sure of it." As the first rays of dawn painted the room with soft, golden light, Claire couldn't help but marvel at how natural it felt to lie beside Lucas. His arm draped lazily over her waist, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her skin. The quiet hum of the city waking up outside only added to the intimacy of the moment. "I wasn't expecting last night to be so," she started, her voice playful but tinged with vulnerability. "So perfect?" Lucas finished for her, a confident grin on his lips. Claire rolled her eyes, but her cheeks flushed with warmth. "Confident much?" His laugh was deep, the kind of laugh that made her toes curl. "I don't need to be confident when you look at me like that," he said, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face. His gaze held hers, and for a moment, the air thickened again, their chemistry reigniting with the same intensity as the night before. She didn't resist as he leaned in, his lips capturing hers in a slow, deliberate kiss that sent shivers down her spine. Claire's hands found their way to his chest, the firm warmth beneath her fingers a stark reminder of just how close they were. Lucas deepened the kiss, his hands sliding to the curve of her back and pulling her against him. "You make it impossible to leave," he murmured against her lips. "Then don't," she whispered back, her voice barely audible. The words hung in the air, charged with more meaning than either of them was ready to admit. Lucas's expression softened, and for a moment, he simply held her, their bodies tangled together like they'd been made for each other. But Lucas wasn't one to let a quiet moment linger for too long. With a mischievous smirk, he flipped her onto her back, hovering above her as his lips trailed a path down her neck. Claire's laughter quickly turned to breathy sighs, her fingers tangling in his hair as he continued his exploration. Time seemed to stand still as the two of them gave in to the undeniable pull between them. Every touch was deliberate, every kiss a promise, every shared breath a testament to the passion they'd unleashed. Hours later, as the morning sun climbed higher in the sky, Claire finally managed to untangle herself from Lucas's embrace. She slipped out of bed and padded to the kitchen, the cool tile a welcome contrast to the warmth that still lingered on her skin. She was pouring coffee when she felt Lucas's arms wrap around her from behind. "Leaving without saying goodbye?" he teased, his lips brushing the curve of her shoulder. "Hardly," she replied, leaning into him. "I figured you could use some fuel after last night." His laugh was low and full of promise. "Last night? You mean the beginning of something I'm not letting end anytime soon?" Claire turned in his arms, her heart skipping at the intensity in his gaze. "You're full of surprises, Lucas." "Stick around," he said, kissing her softly. "You haven't seen anything yet." The day drifted on, a quiet rhythm falling into place between Claire and Lucas. Their laughter mingled with the faint buzz of the city outside as they lounged together in the living room, the morning turning into afternoon without either of them caring. "I can't remember the last time I spent a day like this," Claire admitted, her head resting on Lucas's shoulder. "Like what?" he asked, his fingers lazily tracing patterns on her arm. "Completely wrapped up in someone else," she said softly, glancing up at him. Lucas smiled, his gaze warm and steady. "Then I'll have to make sure you remember this one." Claire laughed, her cheeks heating as his words sunk in. He had a way of disarming her, peeling back the walls she didn't even realize she'd built. As the evening rolled around, Claire stood in the kitchen, chopping vegetables for dinner. She hadn't planned on spending the entire day with Lucas, but now she couldn't imagine him leaving. He leaned against the counter, watching her with a mix of amusement and admiration. "I didn't know you could cook," he teased. "I didn't know you could charm your way into a second meal," she shot back, a playful grin tugging at her lips. "Fair," he admitted, stepping closer. "But if it means I get to stay a little longer, I'll take my chances." She turned to face him, her hand still holding the knife and a carrot. "Are you always this persistent?" "Only when it comes to something, or someone, I really want." Her heart fluttered at the intensity in his voice, the unspoken meaning clear. She set the knife down and stepped closer, the heat between them simmering just below the surface. "Lucas," she began, but whatever she was about to say was lost as his lips claimed hers in a kiss that stole her breath. Dinner was temporarily forgotten as Lucas lifted her onto the counter, his hands firm on her hips as he deepened the kiss. Claire's arms wrapped around his neck, pulling him closer, their bodies pressed together in a way that made her head spin. The smell of garlic and rosemary eventually broke through the haze of desire, reminding them both of the meal still waiting to be finished. Lucas pulled back, his forehead resting against hers as they both caught their breath. "I guess we should eat," he murmured, his voice rough but full of humor. "Probably," she agreed, though neither of them made a move to step away. Eventually, they managed to finish cooking, their laughter and stolen kisses making even the most mundane tasks feel electric. Over dinner, their conversation flowed effortlessly, touching on everything from childhood memories to wild dreams for the future. As the night wore on, Claire couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. Lucas wasn't just a fleeting connection or a thrilling escape. He was becoming something more, something real. When they finally returned to bed, the passion between them was softer but no less consuming. They moved together with a familiarity that belied the short time they'd known each other, their connection deepening with every touch and whispered word. As they lay tangled together once more, Lucas pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Stay with me," Claire said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. He pulled back slightly, his gaze searching hers. "I wasn't planning on going anywhere." For the first time in a long time, Claire felt a sense of peace settle over her. With Lucas by her side, the possibilities felt endless. The days that followed fell into a delicious rhythm. Lucas stayed, as if he had always belonged in Claire's space. Mornings were filled with lazy kisses and stolen touches over coffee, afternoons spent laughing at inside jokes, and nights burning with an intensity that left them both breathless. But it wasn't all heat and passion. Lucas was curious about everything. He asked Claire about her dreams, her fears, and the small, seemingly inconsequential details of her life that no one had ever thought to notice. And Claire found herself opening up in ways she hadn't before, her usual caution melting away under the warmth of his gaze. One evening, they found themselves on the rooftop of Claire's building, the city lights stretching out like a sea of stars. Lucas had brought up a bottle of wine, and they sat on a blanket, the cool breeze brushing against their skin. "Do you ever think about what's next?" Lucas asked, his voice soft as he swirled the wine in his glass. "For us?" Claire asked, her heart skipping a beat at the weight of his question. "For you," he clarified, though his eyes held a flicker of something more. "For your life, your dreams." Claire hesitated. "I guess I've been too busy just surviving to think about it," she admitted. "But lately, I've been wondering if maybe there's more out there. Something I haven't dared to reach for." Lucas leaned closer, his hand finding hers. "Like what?" She bit her lip, her gaze drifting to the horizon. "I've always wanted to open a little gallery. Showcase local artists, host events. But it's just a dream, you know? Not something I could actually pull off." "Why not?" he asked, his tone serious. "Because it's risky. Because I don't know where to start. Because, what if I fail?" Lucas squeezed her hand, his eyes steady on hers. "You won't. And even if you stumble, I'll be there to catch you." Claire's breath caught at his words, the sincerity in his voice cutting through her doubts. "Lucas," she began, but he silenced her with a kiss, slow and tender, as if to remind her that she didn't have to face anything alone. They stayed on the rooftop until the bottle was empty and the city below grew quiet. When they finally returned to her apartment, the mood had shifted. It wasn't just passion or infatuation anymore, it was something deeper, something neither of them had expected but couldn't deny. The next morning, Claire woke to find Lucas already up, a mischievous smile on his face as he placed a tray of breakfast on the bed. "Good morning," he said, leaning down to kiss her. "Morning," she replied, sitting up and eyeing the tray. "What's all this?" "Fuel," he said simply, handing her a mug of coffee. "For what?" "For you to start planning your gallery," he said, his smile widening. Claire laughed, shaking her head. "You're impossible. And you're unstoppable," he countered. "You just don't know it yet." His faith in her was intoxicating, and for the first time, she started to believe that maybe he was right. The days had been a whirlwind of passion and soft, intimate moments, but tonight, something was different. The air between Claire and Lucas was thick with unspoken tension, charged with a quiet hunger that neither of them could ignore. It had been days since their last heated encounter, and the anticipation had built to a fever pitch. Claire stood in front of her mirror, adjusting her dress, the fabric clinging to her curves in all the right ways. She wasn't sure why she felt the sudden need to look her best tonight, maybe because Lucas had been sending her smoldering glances all evening, making her feel like the only woman in the world. Her heart raced as she heard him approach, the soft pat of his footsteps on the floor behind her. He had a way of moving that made her body respond before she even saw him, silent, yet powerfully present. She turned slowly, catching the heat in his gaze as he leaned against the doorframe. His shirt was unbuttoned just enough to reveal the hard line of his chest, and his eyes, dark and intense, took in every inch of her as if he couldn't get enough. "You look incredible," he rasped, his voice low and full of need. Claire smiled, her lips curving in a way that sent a thrill through Lucas. "I was just about to say the same about you," she teased, crossing the room toward him. Before she could reach him, he was already there, his hands gripping her waist as he pulled her into him with a hunger that left her breathless. Their mouths met in a clash of lips and tongues, the kiss urgent and wild, as if they were trying to make up for lost time. His hands roamed down her back, the touch both possessive and gentle, and Claire melted into him. She needed him. It had been too long, and she wasn't about to wait another second. Without breaking their kiss, she reached for the buttons of his shirt, her fingers trembling with anticipation as she finally pulled it open. His skin was warm under her touch, firm and taut, and she ran her hands over his chest, marveling at the way his muscles shifted beneath her palms. He groaned against her lips, his hands sliding beneath the hem of her dress, skimming over her skin until he found the soft curve of her thigh. His touch was a promise, a slow burn that had her gasping for more. "God, Claire," he murmured, his voice thick with desire. She responded by tugging him closer, pressing herself fully against him, the heat between them growing unbearable. She could feel the hard press of him against her stomach, and it made her pulse quicken. "No more waiting," she whispered, her breath shallow. Lucas's eyes darkened, and he lifted her effortlessly, carrying her toward the bed as if she weighed nothing. He set her down gently, his body following hers onto the soft sheets. The intensity between them was undeniable, each movement, each touch, building to a crescendo of need. He kissed her again, deeper this time, as his hand slid up her dress, pushing it higher, revealing the delicate lace of her lingerie. His fingers traced the edges, teasing and slow, as he watched her with a look that promised to drive her wild. "God, you're perfect," he murmured, his lips grazing her neck as his hands expertly undid the clasps of her lingerie. Claire's body arched toward him, wanting more, needing more. Her fingers found the waistband of his pants, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. She could feel the heat radiating off him, could sense the way he was trembling with the same need she felt. With a growl, he kissed her again, deep and hard, as if he couldn't get enough. His hands roamed down her body, tracing every curve, every line, until they found the softest part of her, where he lingered, teasing her until she was begging for more. "Lucas," she gasped, her voice a mix of desperation and desire. "I'm here," he whispered, his breath hot against her ear. "And I'm not going anywhere." With that, the world around them disappeared. All that mattered was the way they fit together, the way their bodies moved in perfect harmony. The passion was raw, intense, and all-consuming, leaving them both breathless and wanting more. As the night stretched on, they lost themselves in each other, their connection undeniable. And when the morning light finally crept through the curtains, they lay tangled together, their bodies still humming with the aftershocks of their shared desire. "I don't think I'll ever get tired of this," Lucas murmured, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. "Good," Claire replied with a smile, "because neither will I." The next few days felt like a dream. A beautiful, intoxicating dream Claire didn't want to wake from. Lucas had become more than just a lover, he had become a constant, someone who filled her life with passion, excitement, and an undeniable connection. They'd become entwined not just in body but in mind, their chemistry an ongoing fire that burned hotter every time they were together. But as much as Claire reveled in the intensity of their relationship, a part of her knew that something was about to change. She could feel it in the air. It wasn't just the heat that sparked between them in moments of shared silence, it was the quiet conversations, the looks, the way their hands seemed to always find each other. She didn't want to admit it, but she knew they were moving towards something deeper. Lucas, ever perceptive, could tell something was on her mind. It wasn't like her to be distant, to pull back even a little, but that's exactly what she had been doing. They sat together one evening on the couch, the dim glow of a lamp casting soft shadows across the room. Claire rested her head on his shoulder, the space between them charged with the unspoken thoughts that neither had yet to address. "Claire," Lucas murmured, his voice gentle, but the weight of it pressed against her chest. "What's going on in that mind of yours?" Her heart skipped a beat, but she wasn't sure if it was from the question or the way his hand casually brushed the side of her leg, sending a ripple of heat through her body. She loved the feel of his touch, always firm, always sure. But it was different now, more than just the spark of attraction. It was the sense that whatever they had was becoming something more real than either of them had bargained for. "I don't know," she said softly, finally lifting her head to meet his gaze. I think I'm scared." Lucas's brow furrowed slightly. "Scared of what?" "Of this. Of us," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if it's too much too soon? What if I let myself get lost in this, and then it all falls apart?" He took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in slow, deliberate strokes. "Claire, look at me." She lifted her eyes to meet his, and the warmth she saw there soothed her nerves. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice low and certain. "I want this, want you, more than anything. Whatever happens, I'm not going to run. I've never been more sure of anything in my life." Her chest tightened as his words settled over her like a blanket, and she felt the tension in her body ease, just a little. "I'm not going to ask for anything more than you're willing to give," Lucas continued, his voice becoming softer now, more intimate. "But I want you to know that you don't have to be afraid. I'm here. For as long as you'll have me." The sincerity in his eyes made her heart swell with something she hadn't quite been able to name. She leaned in and kissed him softly, letting the moment wrap around them. When they pulled away, her breath was shallow, and she smiled, a little breathless. "I think I want this too," she admitted, her voice barely more than a whisper. Lucas's hand slid to the back of her neck, pulling her toward him once more, but this time, it was different. The kiss was deeper, more deliberate, a silent promise that neither of them could deny. Claire felt her body respond immediately, the familiar warmth spreading through her as his touch became more insistent. He pulled her onto his lap, his hands tracing the curve of her spine, his fingers slipping under the fabric of her dress. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice thick with desire, though there was something in his tone that suggested he wouldn't push her if she wasn't. She nodded, her lips finding his again. "I'm sure." And with that, the night exploded into a frenzy of heat and passion. Each kiss was deeper, each touch more urgent, as if they both needed to remind themselves that they were still here, still burning with desire. There were no words, just the rhythm of their bodies and the feeling of complete surrender to one another. It was everything Claire had ever wanted, and more. Every inch of her skin seemed to hum with anticipation, every touch of his hand igniting a fire deep within her. The world outside disappeared, leaving only the two of them, entwined in a dance of pleasure that seemed to stretch on endlessly. As the night wore on, they finally slowed, their bodies slick with sweat, tangled together in the sheets. Claire's heart still raced, her chest rising and falling with each breath, but the moment was different now. It wasn't just about passion, it was about connection. About trust. Lucas kissed the top of her head, holding her close. "I'm not going anywhere, Claire." She smiled, her body relaxing against his. "Neither am I." The night had only just begun to unfold its secrets. Claire lay nestled against Lucas, her body still humming with the aftershocks of their intimacy. The air between them felt thick with an undeniable tension, but it was no longer just physical, it was something deeper, something more electric, that seemed to draw them even closer. Lucas's fingers traced the line of her back, slow and deliberate, as though memorizing the feel of her skin beneath his touch. He could feel the subtle tremble of her body against his, the way she responded to his every caress. It made something in him stir, a deep hunger that went beyond the mere physical, a desire to know her completely, in every way imaginable. "You're beautiful," he murmured, his voice low and husky, sending a shiver down her spine. Claire closed her eyes, a smile tugging at her lips. She had heard him say it before, but this time, the words felt different. They felt like a promise, a declaration of everything that had yet to come. "I don't think I've ever felt more alive," she admitted, her voice soft as she shifted slightly to face him. Her eyes met his, searching for the same understanding, the same depth that had always existed between them. "With you." Lucas's expression softened, his hand drifting to her cheek, his thumb brushing across her lips in a tender, almost reverent motion. "You make me feel the same way," he whispered. "Like I could spend the rest of my life just being with you, discovering every part of you." Her breath caught at his words, the weight of their intimacy settling in. She was no longer afraid. No longer unsure. The connection between them had evolved into something she hadn't even known she needed, a deep, passionate bond that went beyond the surface, beyond the heat of their bodies. It was trust. It was comfort. It was an understanding that they could lose themselves in each other and never look back. Without saying another word, Claire leaned in, her lips capturing his in a kiss that was gentle at first, almost hesitant. But as soon as she felt the warmth of his mouth on hers, she deepened the kiss, her hands sliding down his chest, feeling the hardness of his body, the way he responded to her touch. His hands were already moving, slipping beneath the fabric of her dress, his fingers brushing over the smoothness of her skin, causing her to gasp. His touch was familiar, but there was something new about it tonight, a hunger that matched her own. "Claire," Lucas murmured between kisses, his voice thick with desire. "I need you." His words were a demand, but there was no harshness in them, only a deep, raw need that mirrored her own. She responded without hesitation, her fingers working to rid him of the last barrier between them, the soft fabric of his shirt. The moment his chest was bare, Claire ran her hands over it, feeling the firm muscles beneath her fingertips, tracing the lines of his body that had come to feel so familiar, so hers. He groaned softly as her hands moved lower, grazing the waistband of his pants. She could feel the heat of him against her, the way his body responded to every touch, every kiss. He was just as hungry for her as she was for him. Without breaking their kiss, Lucas shifted them, moving so that he hovered above her, his eyes locking with hers as he kissed her harder, deeper, more urgently. Claire's hands roamed up his back, feeling the strength of his muscles, the heat radiating from his body. She wanted all of him, wanted to feel him in every way, and she knew that tonight, there was nothing holding them back. Their movements became more frantic, more desperate, as the need between them grew. Claire's breath caught in her throat as Lucas's lips moved down her neck, his hands trailing over her body with a careful intensity that made her pulse race. "Tell me what you want," he whispered, his voice rough with desire. Claire swallowed, her hands threading through his hair as she pulled him closer, her body arching toward him. "I want you. All of you." The words hung in the air between them, an invitation, a challenge, and Lucas didn't hesitate. He kissed her again, his hands moving to the hem of her dress, lifting it slowly, deliberately, as he gazed down at her with an intensity that left her breathless. He wanted to savor every moment, every inch of her, and she could feel it in the way he touched her, in the way he looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. When her dress was finally discarded, leaving her bare beneath him, Lucas didn't waste a second. His hands roamed over her skin, his fingers trailing down the curve of her waist, over her hips, before finally resting on her thighs. The heat of his touch set her skin alight, and she couldn't help the soft moan that escaped her lips as his hands moved higher, teasing and caressing her until she was trembling with need. "God, Claire," he muttered, his voice hoarse as he kissed her again, more passionately this time, his body pressing against hers as if to fuse them together completely. "You drive me crazy." She responded with equal intensity, her hands moving to his pants, undoing the fastenings with urgency. There was no time for hesitation, no room for doubt. All that mattered was the here and now, the way their bodies fit together, the way they burned for each other. When Lucas finally slid into her, they both gasped, the feeling of being completely united sending shockwaves through them both. The world outside disappeared, leaving only the overwhelming sensation of each other, the rhythm of their bodies moving together, a perfect, primal dance. The way they moved together was almost a blur, but Claire could feel every moment, every thrust, every touch as if it were carved into her very soul. It was fast, frantic, but also filled with a tenderness that took her breath away. Lucas's hands gripped her hips, guiding her as they found a rhythm that was both wild and soothing, a perfect balance of raw need and deep connection. Every time they came together, it was more than just pleasure, it was a release, a surrender. Claire's breath became erratic, her pulse racing, as the sensation of him inside her intensified, each movement sending her higher and higher. She reached for him, pulling him closer, her hands running over the taut muscles of his back, feeling the way he tensed, the way his body responded to her touch. With a low growl, Lucas kissed her again, his lips tasting like sin as his thrusts grew harder, deeper. Claire's world was spinning, her senses overloaded, but she didn't care. She needed this, needed him in a way that went beyond the physical. She wanted to lose herself in him completely. "Lucas," she gasped, her body shaking as the pleasure built inside her. But before she could finish, he silenced her with another kiss, his body moving faster now, pushing her to the edge. The world around them seemed to blur as they both neared the brink, their bodies moving together in a perfect harmony, each touch, each breath, building them both toward the same explosive climax. And when it came, it was nothing short of overwhelming. Claire's body arched beneath him, her fingers digging into his shoulders as the wave of pleasure crashed over her, leaving her breathless, her body trembling. Lucas followed soon after, his name escaping her lips as his body stiffened, as if every part of him had been consumed by her, by them. For a long moment, they lay together, their bodies entwined, their breaths mingling in the quiet aftermath. Neither of them spoke, but there was an unspoken understanding in the way their fingers intertwined, in the way Lucas held her close, as if he never wanted to let go. Claire rested her head on his chest, her body still humming with the aftershocks of their passion. She felt complete in a way she never had before, and she knew, in that moment, that nothing would ever be the same again. Lucas pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. "I don't think I'll ever get tired of this," he said quietly. Claire smiled, her hand running over his chest. "Neither will I." The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow over the room. Claire woke to the warmth of Lucas's body wrapped around hers, his breath steady and slow against her neck. For a moment, she just lay there, savoring the intimacy of the moment. The night had been something beyond their previous encounters, a perfect blend of desire and tenderness, wild passion and sweet connection. She had never felt more in tune with anyone in her life. The room was quiet except for the soft sounds of their breathing, and Claire couldn't help but feel a sense of peace, a calm she hadn't expected. There was something about waking up beside Lucas, the way he held her as if she was the most precious thing in his world. It wasn't just the physical satisfaction they shared, it was the emotional bond that had developed so naturally between them. As her thoughts drifted, she felt Lucas stir beside her. He tightened his arm around her waist, pulling her a little closer, his lips grazing the back of her neck in a tender kiss. "Morning," he whispered, his voice deep and husky, still laced with the remnants of sleep. Claire smiled, turning her head to face him. "Morning," she replied softly, her fingers tracing the lines of his jaw, the stubble there sending a soft prickling sensation under her touch. Lucas's eyes flickered open, locking with hers. There was something unspoken in his gaze, a mixture of passion and tenderness that made her heart skip a beat. Without a word, he leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a kiss that was slow, lingering, and full of promise. It wasn't the urgent, fiery kiss of the night before. No, this one was softer, more intimate, a kiss that spoke of everything they were becoming, everything they wanted to explore together. "I could wake up like this every day," Lucas murmured, his lips grazing hers again before he pressed his forehead gently against hers. "Me too," Claire replied, her voice barely above a whisper. They stayed like that for a while, wrapped in each other's arms, savoring the closeness. But soon, the morning started to stir, and the quiet peace began to give way to the hunger that still simmered beneath the surface. Lucas's fingers gently traced the curve of Claire's back, sending a shiver down her spine. His touch was light, playful at first, but Claire could feel the shift in the air, the subtle change from comfort to something more intense. He pulled away just enough to look into her eyes, his expression a mix of admiration and longing. "You know, I can't seem to get enough of you," he murmured, his voice thick with desire. Claire's heart raced at the raw honesty in his words, and she felt that familiar pull deep inside her, an ache that only he seemed to know how to satisfy. She reached up to cup his face, her thumb gently brushing over his lips. "I feel the same way," she whispered, the words slipping from her lips before she could stop them. She had always been the type to guard her emotions, to keep them in check, but with Lucas, everything felt different. She didn't need to hold back. She didn't need to hide how she felt anymore. He kissed her again, this time deeper, more urgently. His hands moved to her waist, sliding beneath the hem of her shirt, his touch burning through the fabric as if he couldn't get enough of her skin. Claire's breath caught as his fingers grazed the soft skin of her stomach, sending a thrill through her body. Before she could react, Lucas rolled them over so that she was on top, the position putting her in control, but she didn't feel the need to take charge. No, with him, she didn't have to worry about anything. She simply let go, allowing herself to feel every sensation, every touch, every spark of electricity that seemed to ignite between them. Claire's hands wandered down his chest, over the hard muscles of his abdomen, until she reached the waistband of his pants. She hesitated for a moment, feeling the weight of the moment, but Lucas's hand covered hers, guiding it gently. "Don't hold back," he whispered against her lips. "I want you, Claire. All of you." His words stirred something deep within her, and she couldn't resist. She undid the buttons of his pants, her fingers trembling slightly as she finally slid them off. She looked down at him, his body beneath hers, and she felt a wave of possessiveness wash over her, a desire to claim him in the most intimate way. Without another word, she lowered herself to kiss him again, this time with a hunger that matched his. His hands moved up her body, sliding beneath her shirt, lifting it off in one smooth motion, leaving her exposed before him. "You're breathtaking," Lucas murmured, his voice a soft rasp as his hands roamed over her body, tracing every curve, every line, as if he was memorizing the feel of her skin. Claire's breath quickened as he leaned up to kiss the delicate curve of her neck, his lips pressing soft, teasing kisses along the sensitive skin. Her body arched instinctively toward him, urging him to continue, to explore every inch of her. She felt the heat of him everywhere, the intensity of their connection overwhelming her. His hand slid down her back, pulling her closer to him, pressing her chest to his. The pressure of his body against hers was almost too much, and she moaned softly, lost in the sensation. "Lucas," she breathed, her voice thick with desire. "I'm here," he whispered, his lips finding hers once again. The kiss was slow, deep, a melding of passion and affection that sent waves of heat through her body. He shifted again, his hands moving to her thighs, gently guiding her as he began to take control. The shift was subtle at first, his movements slow and deliberate as he kissed her deeper, more passionately. Claire couldn't help but respond, her body moving in time with his, urging him closer, wanting him more. Her hands moved to his chest, tracing the muscles there as she pressed herself against him, feeling the heat of his body burn against hers. He responded in kind, his hands sliding down to the curve of her hips, pulling her even closer. There was nothing but the heat between them now, the world outside fading into oblivion as they lost themselves in each other. Their bodies moved together, a slow and sensual rhythm that built with every kiss, every touch. There was nothing hurried about it. This was not about simply reaching the end, it was about savoring every second, exploring every inch of each other's skin, every soft sigh, every breathless whisper. The intensity between them was palpable, the way their bodies fit together perfectly, as if they were made for each other. Lucas's touch was tender yet demanding, guiding her with a confidence that left her breathless, wanting more. Claire could feel the warmth spreading through her, the familiar pull deep in her stomach, and she knew she was close. She could feel it in every touch, every movement, every brush of his lips against her skin. With a soft gasp, she reached the edge, her body shuddering as the wave of pleasure crashed over her. She cried out his name, her fingers digging into his skin as she lost herself in the sensation. Lucas followed soon after, his body stiffening as the pleasure took over, his name slipping from his lips in a low growl. The world seemed to stop, everything disappearing except for the two of them, tangled together in the aftermath of their passion. For a long moment, they lay there, breathless and spent, the silence between them comfortable, intimate. Lucas pulled her closer, his arms wrapping around her as he kissed her forehead softly. "I don't ever want to let go of this," he whispered, his voice quiet but full of emotion. "Me neither," Claire replied, her hand resting on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palm. It feels like home." And in that moment, it did. Their bodies, their hearts, their souls had intertwined in a way that went beyond the physical. It was more than just passion, it was trust, it was connection, it was love. They drifted off to sleep in each other's arms, the world outside forgotten, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. The days that followed felt like a dream to Claire. She woke up each morning to the warmth of Lucas beside her, his presence grounding her, filling her with a sense of calm she hadn't realized she needed. They spent hours talking, laughing, and sharing their thoughts with one another, discovering new layers of each other that deepened their bond. It was a connection that went beyond passion, it was about understanding, about trust. But with each passing day, Claire couldn't shake the growing realization that what they shared was something truly rare. She had always been afraid of falling too deeply, of letting someone see every vulnerable part of her. But with Lucas, she didn't feel that fear. He was her safe space. His touch wasn't just physical, it was a promise, a vow that no matter what happened, they would face it together. It was the evening of their 5th night together when Lucas took her hand and led her to the balcony of her apartment. The city was quiet below them, the streetlights flickering in the distance, casting a soft glow over the landscape. Claire leaned against the railing, feeling the cool breeze against her skin as Lucas stood beside her, his fingers intertwined with hers. "This is perfect," Claire whispered, taking in the beauty of the moment. She had always loved the city at night, but tonight felt different. Tonight, everything seemed to be aligned in a way that made her feel as though the universe was right where it needed to be. Lucas looked at her, his eyes full of warmth. "You're perfect." The compliment sent a warmth flooding through her chest, and she turned to face him, her gaze locking with his. There was a depth in his eyes, an honesty that made her heart flutter. It wasn't just the physical attraction, it was the way he looked at her, as if she were the most important person in the world. As if he couldn't imagine a life without her. "Lucas," she began, her voice soft, unsure of how to put the overwhelming emotions into words. "I never thought I'd find something like this. Something so real. So powerful." He took a step closer, his hand gently cupping her cheek. "I feel the same way," he murmured, his thumb brushing over her skin in a tender motion. "I never thought I'd meet someone like you. Someone who makes everything else seem insignificant." Claire's breath hitched at his words, her heart racing. She could feel the intensity of the moment, the weight of the feelings between them. Slowly, she reached up, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, before pulling him in for a kiss. It started slow, tentative, as though they were savoring the moment, but quickly grew more passionate. His hand slid down her back, pulling her closer, as the kiss deepened. The world around them seemed to vanish. It was just the two of them, their bodies pressed together, their hearts beating in unison. Claire's fingers tangled in his hair, her other hand sliding to the back of his neck, urging him closer. She wanted to feel him in every way, wanted to lose herself in him. When they finally pulled away, breathless and with hearts pounding, Lucas rested his forehead against hers. "I don't want this to end," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Neither do I," Claire replied, her lips brushing against his in a soft, lingering kiss. The silence that followed was comfortable, the quiet intimacy between them growing with each passing second. Claire's mind raced with the thoughts she'd been holding back, the emotions she had been afraid to fully acknowledge. She knew, deep down, that what they shared was something extraordinary. But was she ready to admit that to herself? To him? Lucas seemed to sense her hesitation. He pulled back slightly, his hand still resting on her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. "You don't have to say anything," he said softly. "But I need you to know that I'm all in. No hesitation. No games. Just us." Claire's heart fluttered at his words. There was no mistaking the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't asking for her to make promises, he was just asking for her to take a step forward, to embrace what they had. "I'm all in, too," she whispered, the words finally spilling from her lips with the honesty she had been holding back. "I've never felt anything like this before. With you, I'm not afraid. I'm ready." And with that, everything changed. The weight of her words hung between them, the promise of something more solidified in the space they shared. They didn't need to say anything more, there was nothing left to say. They simply stood there, holding each other, allowing the silence to speak for them. As the night deepened, they returned inside, the warmth of their shared connection keeping them close. Lucas kissed her again, this time with an intensity that matched the emotions swirling between them. He kissed her with the promise of more, not just of passion, but of the future. Claire responded with equal fervor, her body instinctively arching toward his as he guided her to the bed. This time, their lovemaking was slower, more deliberate. There was a tenderness to it, a deep connection that neither had experienced before. It wasn't just about the physical, it was about surrendering to each other, about giving themselves completely. Lucas moved over her with a careful intensity, his hands tracing the curves of her body, exploring every inch of her as if he were discovering her for the first time. His lips never left her skin, and Claire found herself completely immersed in him, in the warmth of his touch, the softness of his kisses. "I love the way you feel," he murmured against her neck, his breath hot and shallow. "You're everything I've ever wanted." Her pulse quickened at his words, and she responded by pulling him closer, her body aching for him. The sensation of him inside her was more than just physical, it was a deep, intimate connection that made everything else fade away. She could feel every inch of him, every movement, every breath as they moved together in perfect harmony. Their bodies fit together as if they were made for each other, each touch, each kiss, building them towards something greater. The pleasure built slowly, with every soft gasp, every whispered word of affection. It wasn't rushed, it was the culmination of everything they had shared, everything they had become. When they reached the peak, it was a shared experience, an explosion of sensation that left them both breathless, clinging to each other in the aftermath. For a long moment, they lay together, their bodies intertwined, hearts still racing, unable to fully comprehend the depth of the emotions that had just been stirred. "I don't want to let go of this," Claire whispered, her fingers tracing the line of his arm as she nestled closer to him. "You don't have to," Lucas replied softly, his hand resting on her back, pulling her even closer. "I'm not going anywhere." And in that moment, Claire knew that they had crossed a threshold. What had started as something physical had transformed into something far deeper, a bond that neither of them had expected but that they both needed. There was no more uncertainty, no more fear. Only the certainty that they had found something worth holding on to. The next few days passed in a blur of warmth and tenderness. Claire and Lucas spent most of their time together, exploring the city, sharing quiet evenings, and savoring each moment they could. It was as though they had created their own little world, one where nothing and no one else mattered. They had fallen into an easy rhythm, each day feeling like a natural progression of the love they were beginning to realize they had for one another. But beneath the sweetness and comfort, a growing sense of urgency began to build. They hadn't spoken the words yet, neither of them had said "I love you." But there were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when they both felt it. It was one of those moments that came unexpectedly one evening, as they sat together on the couch in Claire's apartment, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about their pasts. Lucas had his arm draped casually around her shoulders, and Claire rested her head on his chest, her fingers tracing the lines of his shirt absently as they spoke. She was telling him about her childhood, how she'd grown up in a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business. "I used to dream about something more," she said softly, her voice quiet but filled with longing. "I never felt like I fit in. Like there was a bigger world out there that I was missing. And then, I came here. And I thought, maybe I could be someone else. Someone more. But it's never been easy. I've always felt a little lost, a little out of place." Lucas tilted his head, his gaze soft and understanding as he looked down at her. "I get it," he said quietly. "I always thought the same thing. That there was something more waiting for me, but I just didn't know where or how to find it." Claire looked up at him then, her eyes meeting his with an intensity that left her breathless. There was something in the way he was looking at her, something that made her heart beat faster. "I think I found it," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Lucas's eyes softened even more, his hand gently cupping her chin and tilting her face up toward his. For a moment, neither of them spoke. They just looked at each other, the weight of the unspoken words hanging between them. And then, Lucas kissed her, slowly at first, just the briefest brush of his lips against hers, as if testing the waters. But Claire couldn't hold back anymore. She responded instantly, deepening the kiss, pulling him closer as her hands slid to his chest, feeling the heat of his body under her fingers. The kiss grew more urgent, the passion rising like a tidal wave between them. Claire felt her pulse quicken, her breath catching in her throat as she let herself fall into the moment. She wanted him in a way that went beyond desire. This was more than just attraction. This was about needing him, craving the connection they shared. With a sudden, unexpected urgency, Lucas pulled her onto his lap, his hands running up and down her back as he kissed her more deeply, his tongue teasing hers in a way that made her heart race. Claire's hands moved to his shirt, eager to feel more of him, but he gently stopped her. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice husky, his forehead resting against hers. She looked into his eyes, and in that moment, everything felt clear. She didn't need words to explain it. She nodded slowly, her hands resting on his chest as she whispered, "I'm sure." And then, there were no more words. Lucas stood up, lifting her effortlessly as he carried her to the bedroom. The world around them faded into nothingness, and all that existed was the undeniable pull between them. Every kiss, every touch, was a promise that they were moving forward together. When they reached the bed, Lucas gently laid her down, his hands roaming over her body with a tenderness that took her breath away. Every movement, every glance, was filled with the quiet intensity of their connection. Claire's body responded to him, her senses on fire as his lips traced the delicate curve of her neck, sending shivers of pleasure coursing through her. She arched toward him, her hands clutching at his shirt, eager to feel the heat of his skin beneath her fingers. He pulled away just enough to look at her, his expression a mix of desire and tenderness. "I want you, Claire. More than anything." "I'm yours," she whispered, her voice shaky with the intensity of the moment. And then, they came together in a union that was both slow and passionate, a rhythm that matched the beating of their hearts. Every touch was electric, every kiss a spark that ignited something deep inside them. There was no hurry, this wasn't just about passion. It was about surrendering to each other completely, about giving and receiving in equal measure. Their bodies moved in perfect harmony, the sensations building as the minutes passed. Lucas's hands were everywhere, tracing the lines of her body, sliding over her curves, memorizing the way she responded to his touch. Each gasp, each breathless moan that escaped her lips only fueled his desire, and he kissed her with a feverish intensity, his lips and hands worshipping her in ways that made her feel more beautiful than she ever had before. Claire responded with equal passion, her hands roaming over his body, pulling him closer, urging him to take her further. She could feel the heat of him, the strength of his desire, and it sent waves of pleasure through her. When they finally reached the peak of their passion, it was as though the world exploded around them, a wave of ecstasy that left them both breathless and trembling. Lucas collapsed beside her, pulling her into his arms as they both tried to catch their breath. They lay there, the aftershocks of their shared experience still pulsing through their bodies, and Claire felt a deep sense of contentment settle over her. She had never felt more connected to anyone in her life. "I don't think I'll ever get enough of you," Lucas whispered, his voice soft but filled with emotion. Claire smiled, resting her head on his chest as she closed her eyes. "You don't have to," she whispered back. "I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time in a long time, she believed it. She had found something real, something worth holding on to. Something that was worth giving herself to, body and soul. Days blurred into nights as Claire and Lucas grew closer, their bond strengthening with each passing moment. What began as a spark of physical attraction had turned into something far deeper, something they both realized was irreplaceable. There was a quiet, almost unspoken understanding between them now, a sense of comfort in the way they moved through life together. They didn't need grand gestures to validate their feelings for each other. Their love was evident in the small moments, shared glances, lingering touches, and the quiet intimacy of just being in each other's presence. It was a Friday evening when they decided to take a spontaneous trip outside the city. The crisp air of the countryside was the perfect backdrop for them to unwind from the chaos of their busy lives. Claire had packed a bag of essentials, a bottle of wine, some snacks, and a few blankets, while Lucas took care of the logistics of the trip. Their drive was filled with easy conversation, music playing softly in the background, and the occasional laughter as they shared silly anecdotes from their pasts. When they arrived at the secluded cabin they had rented for the weekend, the world felt a million miles away. It was a small, cozy place nestled in the woods, far from the noise and distractions of the city. The wooden beams and rustic charm of the cabin immediately put them at ease, offering a sense of tranquility that felt like a breath of fresh air. Lucas set the wine on the table while Claire spread out the blankets on the floor in front of the fireplace. The fire crackled to life as they settled in, the warmth of the flames mixing with the heat of their growing connection. "It's perfect here," Claire murmured, her eyes fixed on the fire as she leaned back against Lucas, her body resting against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her, pulling her closer, feeling the steady rhythm of her heartbeat against his own. "I'm glad you like it. I thought we could use a little escape." "I think you're right," she said, tilting her head back to look up at him. Her eyes locked with his, and for a moment, the world around them disappeared. Everything felt centered around the two of them, an intimate bubble where nothing else mattered. Their lips met again, slow and deliberate, as if savoring the taste of each other. The kiss deepened as Claire's hands moved to his shirt, eager to feel the warmth of his skin beneath her fingertips. Lucas responded in kind, his hands sliding up her back, pulling her closer. Her heart skipped a beat. She had heard those words before, but the weight they carried now felt different, more profound. She needed him too, in a way that went beyond the physical. Their connection had transcended just passion. It was about giving themselves fully to each other, trusting in the love they had built. With a soft smile, Claire kissed him again, this time with a tenderness that reflected the depth of her feelings. "I'm yours," she whispered against his lips. In every way. And with that, the barriers between them came down completely. The rest of the evening passed in a blur of heat and tenderness. Their bodies came together in a rhythm that felt both familiar and new, each touch, each kiss, deepening their connection. There were no words between them now, only the sound of their breath, the steady rhythm of their hearts, and the flickering fire casting shadows across the room. In the quiet aftermath, Claire lay nestled in Lucas's arms, her fingers tracing patterns on his chest as they both caught their breath. The world outside seemed so far away, and in that moment, Claire couldn't imagine being anywhere else. I never want to leave this, she murmured softly. Lucas smiled down at her, his hand gently caressing her back. We don't have to. We have all the time we need. And as they lay there, wrapped in the warmth of each other's embrace, Claire realized that this moment, this connection, this love, was exactly what she had been searching for. She had found not just passion, but partnership, and it was everything she had ever wanted. The next morning, the sunlight streamed through the windows of the cabin, bathing the room in a soft, golden glow. The air was fresh, crisp from the night's chill, and the forest outside whispered with the promise of new beginnings. Claire awoke slowly, her body curled into the warmth of Lucas's arms. She could hear his steady breathing, feel the rise and fall of his chest beneath her cheek, and for a brief moment, everything felt perfect. She stretched slightly, the events of the previous evening still lingering in her mind, the love, the passion, the quiet tenderness that had followed. It was more than she had ever hoped for. She had spent so long searching for something real, something lasting, and now, in Lucas, she had found everything. As if sensing her thoughts, Lucas stirred, his arms tightening around her. Morning, he murmured, his voice low and husky, still thick with sleep. Good morning, Claire replied, her heart swelling as she looked up into his eyes. There was something different in the way he looked at her now, something more profound, more certain. He smiled softly, brushing a lock of hair from her face. I could get used to this, he said with a grin, his thumb gently tracing her jawline. Waking up with you every morning, it feels like home. Claire's heart skipped a beat. The words settled into her chest like a promise, and she felt the depth of her feelings for him wash over her. She had never expected to find something like this, something that felt so real, so true. But here she was, with him, and everything just felt right. I think I could get used to it too, she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, her fingers tracing the edge of his lips. Lucas leaned in, his lips brushing against hers in a soft, lingering kiss. It was a kiss full of promises, of days and nights to come, of love that would only deepen with time. When they finally pulled apart, their foreheads rested together, and Lucas's hand found hers, their fingers interlacing as they both lay there, content and peaceful. I've been thinking, Lucas said, his voice serious now, as he looked at her with that familiar intensity in his eyes. About us. About what this is. Claire's heart thudded in her chest. She was no stranger to the uncertainty that came with relationships, but with Lucas, she had never felt anything but sure. What are you thinking? She asked, her voice steady despite the flutter of nerves in her stomach. He took a deep breath, his gaze never leaving hers. I'm thinking that what we have is real. I'm thinking that I want this, Claire. I want you, not just now, not just for this moment, but forever. I want to build a life with you. Tears filled her eyes, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming joy and love she felt in that moment. She had never imagined she would hear words like these, but now that they were spoken, everything about their connection felt undeniable. Lucas, she said, her voice trembling with emotion, I want that too. I want it all. I want to share my life with you, every part of it. I'm ready. He smiled, a wide, joyful grin that lit up his face. Then let's make it happen. Let's start our forever right now. And with that, The weight of everything they had built, every laugh, every touch, every shared secret, solidified into something real. They didn't need grand gestures or dramatic declarations. What they had was quiet and constant, a love that didn't need to be explained because it was felt in every word, every action, every glance. The rest of the weekend passed in a blissful haze of laughter, quiet moments of intimacy, and shared plans for the future. They talked about their dreams, their hopes, and what they wanted their life together to look like. They talked about moving in together, about the adventures they would go on, about growing old together. When it was time to leave the cabin, neither of them wanted to go. But as they drove back to the city, hands intertwined, they both knew that this was just the beginning. The beginning of a life built on love, trust, and a shared vision of the future. As they pulled into Claire's apartment building, Lucas turned to her, his expression serious once again. "Claire," he said softly, "I want you to know something. You are everything to me. I'm not going anywhere. No matter what happens, I'm here. And I always will be." Claire's heart swelled with affection for him. "I know, Lucas," she said, her voice full of certainty. "And I'm here for you, too. Always." They kissed then, slow and sweet, the promise of forever lingering between them. And as Claire pulled away, she knew in her heart that no matter what the future held, they would face it together. The days that followed were filled with the joy of building a life alongside each other, moving in together, creating new routines, and continuing to share their love in every way. They traveled, explored new passions, and supported each other through everything that came their way. There were challenges, as there are in every relationship, but together, they learned how to navigate them with strength and love. As the years passed, Claire and Lucas's love only grew deeper. They found themselves not just partners in life, but best friends, confidants, and everything in between. They celebrated the small victories, the quiet moments, and the big milestones. And in each of those moments, they were reminded of the bond they shared, a bond that was unbreakable, unshakable, and full of love. One evening, years down the road, Lucas looked at Claire with the same depth of love he had the first time they met. They had built a life together, a beautiful life, full of laughter, passion, and shared dreams. And in that moment, they both knew that their love would last a lifetime, a love that had started with a spark and had grown into something that neither of them could ever imagine being without.